Welcome to Architects for Change, the podcast that bridges the gap between architecture, the built environment and politics. I'm Jay Morton, your host. I'm an architect and political geek, and together we'll hear from the change makers and thought leaders who are shaping the future of our cities and spaces. Our conversations will tackle pressing questions that hold the key to our future. How can we achieve a net zero future? What does it truly take to design a better world? And most importantly, how can politics play a pivotal role in breaking down the barriers that hinder progress? Welcome, Tamara Cincik. It's really great to have you on the Architects for Change podcast. Again, a lot of people I've interviewed in the first series were architects and people directly from the built environment. But in this series, I'm trying to sort of branch out a little bit more because I think there's sort of lots of things that are relevant from different industries back to the built environment. And I think one of the key reasons why I wanted to talk to you is to talk about the work that you've been doing with Fashion Roundtable, bridging that gap between your industry and politics, but also sort of the wider conversations about the creative industries and also our high streets as well, and also a little bit about your background. So it's really great to have you on. I suppose the first thing to say is how we actually met, because we met as part of the Fabian Women's Network, which is now sort of this wonderful network of women that are doing absolutely amazing things. So I think it's definitely worth having a little shout out there as to how we actually know each other. About me, maybe can you tell us a little bit about you, your career journey, and how you set up Fashion Roundtable, and a bit about your background as well?
Thanks, Jay. So my name's Tamara Cincik. I am the daughter of two hairdressers. I grew up in the council flat that came with their first business, which was on a shopping precinct built after the war in the suburbs of London in a place called South Oxley, since demolished to build private housing. So I have a lot to say about the post-war vision, although I was born much later than that. But that vision that was still in place when I was a child, and what I see is the breakdown of that, and therefore the opportunities that people from my generation, I'm a Generation Xer, I'm a bit older than you, had, and we took for granted, but our generation, who are now the policymakers, seem to be quite happy to take away from younger generations. I was the first in my family to go to university. I went to UCL, where I read English. I then went into the fashion industry with no real contacts other than one person. And I was able to intern. At the time, I was able to sign on. So again, seeing the welfare state supporting young people into the creative industries, and that was completely legitimate, and get housing benefit. And I was able to live in London and work. And then I worked, and I mean, my taxes have more than paid back what I took. And I was in the fashion industry for a number of years. I was a fashion editor and stylist. And I think it was when I had my son, who's 13 now, that I really hit the kind of ceiling of opportunity for women. It was very difficult being freelance to justify the cost of the childcare, which was really expensive, even though I was using what had been a Sure Start. It'd been closed because the Tories had come in the coalition, but they'd reopened it as a charity in the area that I lived in then, which was Gospel Oak in North London. And then I was able to start him when he was about 18 months, doing a couple of days a week, but I couldn't quite fathom how difficult it was. And that led to Christine reaching out to me on Facebook when I was ranting.
This is Christine Megson.
Yeah, after Ed Miliband lost, because I was already a member of the party. In fact, I joined when the coalition won in typical Tamara style. I joined a losing battle to help make it win. So I'd gone to a couple of events that Ed Miliband had been speaking at and thought he spoke a lot of sense, and then saw the media at play, the media of which I was a part of in the fashion industry. And I understood the dynamics of how he was being portrayed versus what he was saying. And I was absolutely incensed, because I knew that him losing meant Brexit. And I knew that Brexit was, you know, aside from the identity politics, was business suicide. And then so I applied, and I took it really seriously. I went to everything. And my mentor then offered me a role in her office, and I was doing that while still styling.
So interrupt on that. So Christine Megson runs the Fabian Women's Mentoring Scheme, which is a mentoring scheme run by the Fabian Women's Network of the Fabian Society, which is a left-wing think tank.
Centre left, I'd say. I don't think it's completely left-wing.
It's affiliated with the Labour Party. Yeah.
And so I applied. I met you there. I had massive imposter syndrome. It was my first time in the Houses of Parliament, and I kind of realised that I understood a lot more than I thought. I think not so much about how bills become acts, but running your own business means you're doing your own tax returns. You're trying to keep afloat. You're understanding how to hire staff. I had staff as a stylist, and also I worked internationally, and seeing that there wasn't as much engagement as I would have thought we needed during what was a very important period in our history and economic future, I set up, on a whim, did a roundtable, again, the whim, and it's kind of my gut talking when that happens, because I'd been to see Hilary Benn speak with someone from the Sunday Times, and thought that he spoke a lot of sense, and said, can I organise a round table, which I then did in a week. And then Culture Minister also turned up, I think, because his SPAD had texted him going, you better get here quickly. And then he offered to do a round table.
The Culture Minister at the time?
Hancock.
I remember, yes. I remember that other meeting that you set up where he was incredibly rude to really, really fabulous people as well.
Yeah. And then...
Because he didn't know who they were.
No, he didn't know who they were. And that speaks to a lack of engagement, because if you work in Parliament, you see that there's always people coming in and out, and they will be from charities or aviation or automobiles or pharmaceuticals, and yet they don't earn as much for the industry, for the UK economy, as the fashion industry. So it's completely counterintuitive. So if you've worked in politics, and maybe you've studied politics at university, you might even come from a political family, which many of the new cohort of Labour MPs actually do, and then you go into politics, having studied politics, having lived and breathed it. It's very different from growing up in a shopping precinct in the suburbs of London with hairdressers and an immigrant dad on what was a National Front council estate. So I had a very different upbringing, but I would say that I'm probably more in touch, or was certainly more in touch with the metrics of why Brexit and issues like that happened, and the people who were leading the Remain campaign. And although that's the divergence from maybe what you wanted to speak about, I think it's
all relevant. It
speaks to the heart of making sure that you have widespread engagement with people from aspects of community. And you could meet me. I'm called Tamara. It could seem like I'm from a certain kind of a background, but I'm absolutely from the working classes, and I'm very proudly working class. But what I would say is that working class is also aspirational.
And I suppose it's that through your journey, seeing those different, you've mentioned a few of those points already about what enabled you to reach that, to be aspirational. So, we've talked about, housing is something that gets talked about a lot on this podcast, and I think it's being talked about a lot about with the current government. But actually that you mentioned the sort of access to housing and your ability to maybe be sort of a bit more entrepreneurial. Maybe can you elaborate on that a little bit further?
Sure. So, when my parents bought the salon, I was born on the Friday, but they bought the salon on the Monday. My dad and mum had met working here. Dad's Turkish, mum's from Enfield, white British, English. And they were both in hairdressing. So they bought a salon, and it came with a flat, and that's what they wanted, understandably, because she was living back at my grandparents in Enfield. And what I observed was there was the communal washroom that was there in the early days, where you could wash your clothes in this space, because we lived in flats with a communal space. They were low level. The precinct acted like two Cs, with the shops in the middle and on the sides. We had the salon next door, but one over. Within like a few yards, you had the police station, the dentist, the doctors, churches, schools, infrastructure. And to me, although I saw the issues with that area, the racism was there, there was poverty there, we were less poor because we had businesses. And I could see how racism can be used as a lever to alienate and to subject and to point the finger at people as though it's their fault. I mean, that's a history. I would say, but what I saw was a functioning community. And what I realised, we left the estate. We had other salons, and we moved off the estate. My parents live off the estate, but a couple of miles away. Is the drilling out of the community? The precinct was allowed to run down. The secondary school was closed. And then the people on the community I'm still in touch with on a Facebook group, and what they say happened was that they were offered a vision of a new precinct, but that isn't what's been delivered. And there's like, instead of a whole run of shops, there's 2 shops. There's nowhere to park. And private housing, because there's a train station that can get you into Euston very quickly, has been put in without the infrastructure build. And I would say, having looked at those flats that have been built, they look like rabbit hutches. They're very high, and they don't really have a balcony. Our balcony was quite big. It was the width of the flat, quite wide, but there was also this communal one, all the children would play out.
Yeah. And then looking into, I suppose, looking at your own industry, do you feel that over the years that the actual demographic of maybe those working in fashion has changed because of that? I know if you feel like with architecture that actually it's going to get harder and harder for people from working class backgrounds to enter.
It's always been a bit of an anomaly. You know, it was like debutante central when I joined, literally debutantes. Yeah. And they are still, there are people that I can think of who have no talent and are literally, the doors that I have fought to open, they seem to swing open for them repeatedly, which is incredibly frustrating. Because the level of entitlement that goes with that. And you see it in a lot of these industries. You know, as a stylist, I work with musicians, and I think most of them have gone to private school. And that's a growing demographic because of the STEM education agenda, which cuts arts out of mainstream education. I think that, you know, could I have been more entrepreneurial? Could I have been braver? 100%. 100%. But I did have the security of a welfare state that you could just about survive on. But I think nobody talks about what that support gives to people, and therefore what they can give back. They just talk about the giving, not what they get back. It
gives you that ability to create a business, try things, find out what actually really does work for you, rather than just trying to keep your head above water.
I mean, I interviewed Stephen Jones, the milliner, a few years ago, and he's a dear friend of mine. He actually made my wedding veil. But what he said was, because they lived in the Warren Street squats, there was a lot of the Blitz kids from the 70s and 80s who lived there. And he said that meant that they could, you know, experiment, try out their business, be creative, be rock stars, you know, and quite a few of them did really well. Boy George was the coat checker at the Blitz nightclub, and, you know, a lot of them were really successful, Stephen being one of them. And it's not always that success
capital, doesn't it?
Yeah, but success shouldn't just be the metric. It should be about well-being, and it should be about what, you know, we are in a wealthy country, and yet we're all feeling a lack.
Yeah. I think because I suppose it's like kind of slightly trapping, isn't it, in a way, where we're at the moment.
Well, it's that, you know, if you've got food banks being normalised in a wealthy country, you have to question where we're at as a society.
Yeah, how do we want to live?
People are working and in poverty. I think back to your original point, and I know I've managed to veer you off course there a little bit, Jay.
Right.
It's very hard to be freelance. It's very challenging. You do earn, if you're successful, you will earn good money, but that one day might be up against 10 when you're not, or more, that you're not working. And if there's not a blanket underneath you, which for working class people economically there isn't, and if their family have had to move to Hull to get a house, then they're not in the southeast, which is where the jobs still are, And given the Oxcam or Camox, whatever they want to call it, corridor, that's still going to help the southeast.
Yeah.
And it's still going to be the centre of power and axis of the creative industries. There are creative jobs outside of London, but they're not of the same level. They're just not.
So do you think we should actually have more decentralisation?
We should be mapping manufacturing infrastructure building with pockets of poverty 100%. Because if you look at, say, the Northeast, that was the shipbuilding heartland of the world. And, you know, looking at mining communities, these were not poor communities before the closure of the mines. And we need to bring manufacturing back to the UK. So when I look at fashion, I don't just look at design and catwalk shows. We're also looking at manufacturing, and we're asking that the government brings public procurement back to made in the UK to stabilise orders for manufacturers who've been through no end of nightmares since Brexit, COVID, and Mike Ashley buying and take asset stripping from brands. So that's had a massive consequence. So I would say that you can't just think of fashion in the world of kind of high octane cocktail parties and catwalk shows with supermodels. It's literally could be nurses' uniforms, school uniform.
And this is, I suppose, going to Fashion Roundtable. I mean, maybe you'd be better off explaining like why you set it up.
I set it up because I was completely bewildered at how politicians that I spoke to when I worked in Parliament for my mentor didn't seem to understand my sector, and I was having to piggyback off opera to talk about special talent, you know, for freedom of movement. And opera is a tiny part of the classical music industry, which itself is a tiny part of the music industry. So I was flummoxed that I was having to piggyback off opera to talk about a multi-billion-pound industry. So it was quite clear that they didn't know about our problems. And if they did, they didn't care. And they didn't seem to care about the numbers. And although the numbers are still high, they have markedly dropped post-Brexit.
So what was the sort of key thing that you are aiming to achieve for a Fashion Roundtable? And also maybe like what have you achieved so far?
Well, I mean, before we launched, there were no parliamentary questions for several years into Parliament, and within a year, I think we had like 50.
That's great.
There's a lot more engagement. I'd still say there's a degree of ignorance, but it certainly isn't through lack of insight. Now it's willful, and it will be political. I still think that they gravitate politicians towards what I call jobs for the boys, which is aviation, pharmaceutical and automobiles, which is really frustrating. We have achieved some issues, but we haven't won on others, and there's always more to do. We're looking more at localism and provenance. So we're looking at ideas around UK made, and I think that's a shift probably from when I started, when it was very Brexit heavy. And we're also looking at what we call the creative wellbeing economy framework, which takes that sense of thriving and creativity as a driver, which is in line with the government's agenda. But I haven't seen much detail on their ambitions around creativity as a driver for economic
So this
growth.
is about sort of understanding the fashion as an industry and the creative industries, and then sort of working out where we can actually sort of boost, not just in the southeast, but in other parts of the country, areas of manufacturing and other elements of the creative industry. Is that a good way of interpreting it?
I would say so, but also we're a change agency. So we did a partnership last September. We delivered with the King's Foundation and YNAP called the Great British Wool Revival. So we remapped the wool industry. Now, from medieval to Georgian times, the wool industry was a thriving economic driver. It was the core of the economy of England then, and of the different nations that now make up the UK. But because of the influx of merino wool for our clothes, and then New Zealand and Australian sheep for our meat, not only have UK farmers lost that two-pronged economic stability from selling the wool and the meat, they're being undercut by an influx of foreign meat, the lamb. And you know, we met with a lot of farmers who were 6 generations in on their farm. This was before the budget, which obviously has incensed the farmers even more. But what that means is that you've got, when we looked at it, everyone was looking at in the kind of sustainable policy space, was talking about innovation with wool. And I said, but first you need to map the problem. And what we need to do is create a map where a designer who might have a whim or an idea of using British wool can actually be set up to meet the mill, and the farmer they can buy from. And we've set that up. Because it's like very 1+1. It's like, let's take it back to basics. Okay, we've identified there's a problem, but if the roadmap isn't simple, I would argue a bit glossy, because fashion people like a bit of glamour, we have to speak to them in their language, and then they'll use it. And we've seen a massive uptake in that, and then that's also developed a consultancy onto it.
I mean, this is also the thing about thinking about all the sort of government new towns and where to build housing and where to build homes, but actually layering that with opportunities for UK manufacturing, whether it be clothing and fashion manufacturing. But also in the podcast that I released this week, I was talking to an engineer who was like, we should totally be investing in low carbon construction materials, quite more small scale industries. They don't need to be huge, can actually start to, and then you're actually starting to invigorate places, invigorate the economy across the country, not just in one place. And you can sort of create a sort of, I suppose this goes back to your well-being point as well, that it sort of gives everywhere a purpose, invest in the economy, and hopefully the country can thrive on the top of that.
Oh, completely. But also, like, you've got to understand that by having targets, if you just push the target down the curb and hope it will go away, it doesn't fix the issues. And if you, I don't know as much as you do about these new towns that the government are looking to build, but they're going to need infrastructure building. But they're also going to need to have jobs. Otherwise, they're just satellite ghost towns. Now, when you read the history of where I grew up, because it was where the East Enders were sent to, apparently they used to walk through the fields to get to the train to go to London until such time as they got jobs in the local community. By the time we lived there, I'd say those people were very entrenched in that local community, and then going to Watford, which was a couple of miles away, or Rittmansworth, which was or Northwood. But when it was first built, it was a satellite ghost town for these families commuting back and forth to London. But that changes, and if you're going to build a city, a town, you're going to need the schools, you're going to need the doctors, you're going to need the dentist, you're going to need the transport, you're going to need cheap transport, and you're going to need nurseries, definitely, if you're going to get families to move there who are going to have a commute until there's infrastructure to support their jobs. And without all of that layering, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. In which case, you'd rather pay through the nose to be in a tinier place, in a place where you know that infrastructure works for you.
Yeah, in the cities. So we need to sort of create better placemakers, I suppose, everywhere. Kind of tracking back to the work that you're doing with the creative industries as a whole as well. How important is the creative industries to the economy?
The creative industries before Brexit were growing 11% year on year. They're still one of the largest, but within the creative industries, what you see is a sense of a hierarchy. And what's been interesting is to realise that DCMS are running with the wrong figures for the fashion industry. Okay, they're just looking at design,
right?
And we're not. We're looking at the whole industry. And so they have their figures at a fraction of what we have them at. Which is like in the multi-billions. I'm not going to give you an exact figure simply because the figures for this year are markedly down on last year. But we've got, every year at Fashion Roundtable, we do a value map. And if you go on this year's value map,
I'll put that in the notes.
You will see it, and then you can understand what I'm talking about. But if you compare it to last year's, like Bradford's down massively. In fact, the only areas that are up are Leicester and London.
Interesting.
Everywhere else is down. Down.
I mean, I think quite a lot of industries are down this year compared to, well, even though I think for us the worst I think was 2023. 2024 wasn't much better, and 2025 is still feeling incredibly slow. And I think even now the government's figures are down, actually, aren't they? I think the spending review is going to be a tougher one than they thought it was going to be. But so given they're not,
that tracks back to why they need to bring back onshoring and why they need to invest. You know, when I hear that Scotland invested in ships for, I think it was that were from Poland, not from a Scottish manufacturer, because of the cost, that's the wrong metric. You've got to look at what that does to support local jobs in local communities. Because if you're just looking at the final price cost, you're not looking at the buy-in that gives and the investment that gives. And I would argue in a the global picture has obviously massively shifted since the Brexit vote. But now where we're in a world where there's going to be tariff wars and there's going to be all these costs and there's going to be possible delays getting around canals, and the Middle East is uncertain, more so than it has been in a number of years. I would argue that is exactly the point where, instead of looking at the metric of the final price as the lever of a decision, that policymakers are looking at the wrong, that's the wrong equation.
So it's value is a different term to price.
GVA, not GPD.
Yeah, and the value of, okay, if this then boosts the local economy, then it will actually boost other job creation in that area. Will reduce the welfare budget.
If the government use the same sense of priority about other industries that they do about Sunderland and the car industry, we would see them make very different decisions. And I don't mean this government, I mean all of them. Yeah. So we've all been looking at the wrong figures and not thinking about value, thinking about price, which I think we see that a lot as well when it comes to creating buildings and places. I think there's the understanding, we need that wider understanding of what value actually is, rather than just, obviously, if you cut costs, you don't actually get, you lose, sometimes you lose more than the cost that you've cut, if that makes sense. It's also like, you'll see that in a job, going back to my old job as a stylist, if I had a client that was cutting corners, there would always be a moment at the 10 to midnight of the shoot where they would then spend a load of money because they had undercut, and it would have been cheaper for them to be less bargain hungry in the beginning and spread the cost, and got the result where they haven't alienated everybody. Everybody's run ragged trying to cut corners, and they end up paying more, because by the 11th hour you're not going to get the bargains that you could have got in place with a bit more love and kind of generosity. It's actually, I'm the daughter of a gambler, and you have to know how to play your cards. And I think a lot of people think they're good at gambling, and they're really not very good at it.
So you're obviously, with the research that you're doing, you're coming up with different figures. How do we sort of get, cause it feels from what you're saying that the sort of economic and cultural power of the creative sector has been overlooked by successive governments. They're not understanding that bigger picture. They're just looking at what they think the creative industries is. They're not looking at the sort of wider, how everything connects to each other. How are you, and how is Fashion Roundtable able to sort of make them see the correct picture?
So by complete fluke, and really thanks to the Fabians, because one of our Fabians is now an MP, Ali Gardner.
And she's in Stoke.
She's in Stoke, which is obviously potteries. But I've been connected with Rosie Writing, which is really hard for me to say for some reason. But Rosie Writing is the new MP for Kettering, and she's a former fashion buyer.
Right.
By the time that you launch this podcast, she will be officially the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Ethics and Sustainability in Fashion. So she's taken that on for me from John McNally, who retired at the last election. And I'd say that she's got a very keen interest in supporting the industry because she's from it. And she understands the value of it and the economic value of it, as well as the cultural value of it. And I agree with her on this, is that she thinks that the fashion industry is in the wrong government department. I think we should be in business and trade and not just in culture.
Interesting.
It's not that I don't think that fashion isn't a driver for culture, because I absolutely do. I mean, even speaking about Stephen Jones, just ad-libbing, and I can think of all these people who are definitely voices of culture, small c. But I think we're in the wrong department, because they're not looking at manufacturing and retail within the metric of fashion. And in terms of class, I think there are many people who go into retail who, had they come from privilege, might have been an artist, or they might have been an architect, but they're in retail, or they're in hairdressing. I think my father would have been an artist with a different background, because he is very much creative, but you still have to understand numbers.
Yeah.
You have, and I would argue actually a successful artist understands their value. I worked as a stylist with a number of highly successful photographers and artists, consciously, to understand how they worked. Like Martin Parr, for instance, I worked with, and he definitely knows his value. He's with Magnum as his agency, and his work's iconic, but he knows his worth. And there's nothing wrong with knowing your worth, right?
Yeah.
To a point about privilege, I think it's very hard for working class people sometimes to know their worth.
Yeah, well, because it's not instilled.
It's trained out of us, and that's what the Fabian Women's Networks scheme gave me, was agency for my ambition. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that as well. That realization that you can try things and that you do have value and take risks, have no shame. the other be a bit bolder. I met many people who I thought were, I thought they had adult jobs, they were really smart, and what was I doing? I had all those voices, and then I get talking to them and they really haven't got a clue about the basics of business. And staffing is so crucial to any business working. And like the last budget, the next increase, completely counterintuitive for anyone from business. Looking at investment, because that means that you're not going to hire. If your margins are small, that means you're less likely to make a new hire, which means more interns, which means more people from privilege getting access to those jobs.
And I suppose there's two points of what you've just said, actually, about having MPs who have different backgrounds, which is actually really, really vital to understanding the different industries and the intricacies of all those different industries. And I suppose this is where, like, what you're doing is actually even more important, to sort of create that voice for your industry in Parliament. I want to sort of tap back to what you were saying about the departments, because actually this is an issue that we've, in my industry, we were in the, I think, Department of Media and Sport and Creative Industries.
UCMS, yeah.
And then we moved over to MCH, LG, DLUC. I keep needing to remember exactly the full department name because it keeps changing. But and I think now where we are in the right place, because obviously it's about building homes, but and places. But part of the issue with that is we have become very numbers focused, and I don't think architecture actually gets maybe considered so much, because I think they do still think we are a creative industry and we are part of that cultural capital as well. And I think likewise with your industry, it's manufacturing. It is the sort of, what you were saying, like they listen to the boys stuff. So like the manufacturing and all that sort of, and the economy and the numbers. And then, so fashion probably should move into that, but it probably, do you not feel it still needs maybe the sort of cultural element that there needs to be the understanding that all of these things, whether it be placemaking, building design, fashion, they are also part of our cultural capital, which is incredibly important. So they're already also, that needs, maybe this is where more departmental linking needs to happen, because if you're put in biz, then you're not going to be considered as part of our cultural capital, which is equally important.
So there's 2 points. I agree with you on that, but I also think that we as a culture just don't want to talk about beauty. As though there's something wrong with talking about beauty or joy. Or and so it's kind of like this Protestantism, I guess, that's running through it, of like self-abnegation, of like, oh my God, let's talk about the beauty. So when I was just thinking about, while you were talking about, the work of Thomas Heatherwick and what I saw at King's Cross, and although I kind of loved the old, because I lived around there when it was Bagley's and a cat and, some gas units, whatever they're called.
Gas holders, yeah.
That's it. And not much else. And now it's a kind of thriving. But at least he created something that was sweeping and kind of beautiful and kind of epic. And what I see with, when I'm, say, on a train travelling up to Scotland and I'm going through towns is new builds that have no vision.
Mm-hmm.
They're really like a kind of carbon cutout proto version of a Victorian terrace, except they're not.
Mm-hmm.
And, they're tiny rabbit hutches again. So if
we
we don't talk about beauty, we don't talk about culture.
Yeah.
In France, in Milan, in Italy, they would understand the value. And this is what I used to say. There is a politician who's now an MP, Sarah Coombs, who was Tom Watson's spad when he was Shadow Culture Secretary. And I remember saying to her, you've got to understand, she didn't like it when I said it, but she laughed.
Yeah.
But we're the beautiful people, and you can mock us, but where we go, money goes.
Yeah.
You go to Frieze Art Fair every year and you will see money exchanging hands.
Maybe let's touch, we were talking about places, and it would be good to just have a little touch on the work you've been doing with high street regeneration, since we are talking about place making. So you've been quite actively involved in discussions around high streets. What do you think are the biggest barriers preventing high streets from thriving? Because obviously this goes back to
rent and rates.
So what would you like the government...
If a building's empty and it's empty for a long period of time, I think we should be looking to support local entrepreneurs into having pop-ups so that they can learn about cash flow, profit and loss, what demographics actually want. Because you'll meet a brand, or I call brand, and that makes it sound grand. You meet a designer who's maybe starting, and the amount of times I've heard it, and I'm like, who are you selling to? Who's your consumer? Where do they go? How much money do they have? What do they need? And the designer might not have answered those basic, quite fundamental questions. So doing that would help them understand demographics of consumer choice a bit better and learning their business. It would be fantastic to see that happening with FE and universities a bit more, so that they could get support those fledgling entrepreneurs into the high street. The loss of high street retail is a massive impact on women in the workplace. The drive to online is not driving jobs for women, it's driving jobs for men. Delivery drivers are men in the majority, and those services that support online are male jobs. The beauty of the high street is that you can support the wraparound care obligations that many of us women still seem to carry in larger numbers than men, and therefore it allows women that to be in the workplace in jobs where they're part of their community and support, because of the cost of childcare and adult care that is primarily falling on women, they can support. So I think it's really important. Obviously we now live in a world of omni-channel offering, online has grown, so you can't like put the genie back in the bottle. If the rent and rates are so expensive, which they still are in areas of London and outside, then it's impossible to get your foot on the ladder. And yet we've got empty retail spaces, which are becoming charity shops. I would argue that we need a more divergent approach from councils to support different offers.
And like boosting entrepreneurship
and also boosting local communities for local entrepreneurs, because whilst Cancer Research and Age UK are noble charities, it would also be great to have sustainable brands from local universities or the FE college up the road having a 3 to 6 month window in a shop to really understand what the consumer wants, because that will help them in a really practical way, just as me doing the mentorship with working for my mentor in Parliament gave me a much more practical understanding of the day-to-day nuts and bolts of Parliament. It's actually the nuts and bolts piece of work that I think is vital. My dad always felt with hairdressing, for instance, that you got much more out of being on the salon floor than you did out of going to college, and that's quite a contentious position. But he felt that you learnt a lot more by being in the business.
It's also about engaging with people, and I suppose going back to your point about communities, that taps into sort of elements of loneliness. And I mean, I remember one of the first jobs I had was working in House of Fraser in Chichester, which now that department store is closed and nothing has gone in its place since. But it actually was a hub it was a social space. lots of particularly elderly people used to come in every day just to talk, and they knew all of the staff that worked in there. It was a hub for all the staff. There was a lot of actually a lot of older ladies who worked there, or ladies who had husbands that did jobs, and they could, like you said, they worked part-time and fitted it around childcare. It was also sort of a very social hub as well. And now all of that is completely gone.
When I went to South Oxley before it was being knocked down, or part of it had been knocked down, where I grew up, I went into the salon that my parents had sold a long time ago, but the women that bought it off them were still there, and that she'd put a table in the reception area for the women because the cafe had refused the women because the building workers were making more money with their breakfast than they were out of cups of tea for these old ladies. And I said to her, where are these ladies going to go? Well, it's gone. And she had no answer for me. Now they've lived there for 40 years, these people, maybe more. And I thought it was criminal, actually, that they had been literally cast aside.
So actually our high streets are actually a hell of a lot more than just places to shop.
They're really important.
And we need
they are how we connect with other people, and we are not robots. I felt very isolated during lockdown, and going to the shops was like a treat, wasn't it? And for people whose lives may be more like, I remember thinking that our next door neighbours who were in their 80s, lockdown was like their normal life. Maybe going to the shop for them not in lockdown was like it was for me in lockdown, where it's like a treat. Just talk.
Just have that human interaction and feel like you've done something with your day.
Seeing another person that's not related to you.
So maybe like bringing it back to policy. So we've touched on the importance of the creative industries. We've touched on the work that you've done with Fashion Roundtable and trying to sort of represent the fashion industry. And obviously Brexit's been mentioned. What policy changes, or what would you like to see the current government do in respect to the creative industries and fashion, and maybe the high streets as well?
So we wrote a sector vision, which we wrote just in before the last election, and I think it would be really good if you could share that. The first thing, as I've mentioned, would be public procurement made in the UK. So Keir Starmer, when he wanted to be the leader of the Labour Party, wanted UK-owned companies, but I would argue that's the Michelle Mone business model, and you can just offset that and offshore it. So there would be that. I think, their commitment to STEAM, which is arts education, is laudable, but I'd like to really understand what that means. I would like to see the same level of incentives for the fashion industry that we see for film and high-end TV. So if you make a film or a TV programme here, or part of it here, you'll get a tax incentive. I would like to see that for made in the UK across the board, but definitely for, I'm using the word fashion, but really I mean clothing in that instance. And maybe tax incentives for B Corps. And although B Corp, there are challenges around the B Corp metric, it's the only one I can think of that actually does something around sustainability. And then I think if you're looking at retail, we've just covered, I think there should be support to get entrepreneurs in. If you look at, although he's not in post anymore, the work that Darren Rodwell did as leader of Barking and Dagenham Council, he really supported creatives into workspaces that were on a sliding scale to ensure that it was equitable for people to build their business in that economy. And when I went to see him there, he talked really potently about having, glass so that people who lived on the estate could see the entrepreneur or the business person in that and think that could be me. I mean, it's very basic, but it's, again, it speaks to coming from a community and getting it. Which I think Darren did really powerfully. And I think that you've got to understand that I personally would get rid of all charges on university education. So this is where you want to lift people out of poverty, make it fair.
Are there other countries that you know of that are successfully integrating sort of the creative industries into their policy frameworks?
France, I think, does. France has always understood the culture of the fashion industry and the arts. And I think that Brexit was essentially a gift to the French on lots of levels. And then the unilateral decision of Rishi Sunak, and then kept by this government, of no tax-free shopping, has just gifted international tourism spend to the EU, and even our spend, because we can go there and then get our tax back. It's the most stupid, counterintuitive, non-business savvy decision, and that goes to the heart of them not coming from business. And I think that you've got Scandinavia obviously doing lots of work around sustainability metrics, and then you've got strong recycling agendas in materiality from Italy. Extended producer responsibility is an EU objective. So, and then California has also implemented similar policies. So it's not that there's one that's amazing and we're terrible. It's that just we're lagging behind. And I'd say we're lagging behind because of Brexit. And then either, you know, I would say within the various Conservative governments, there was just no real policy agendas because it was hip hop. And then now we've got, we're taking our time.
So what does the year see for Fashion Roundtable? And are you optimistic that like the government are listening and that change can happen?
I know the government are listening because we had a call with them this last week. So I know they're listening. Are they acting? I think they understand that they need to do more in the four nations and less from London. And although I'm a Londoner, I applaud that because that's how you end up with a left behind community. And actually, I would say that when they mean London, they don't mean South Oxford and Greater London. They mean, you know, the city of Westminster and maybe Camden and Islington. And I mean, you know, I see South Oxford as a parallel to Sunderland for a left behind community who've been objectified and reduced. So I think that they understand that. We've been working with the King's Foundation, and that's been important because I think the King's Foundation really understand the value of hand skills and craft, and that's really powerful. We've been doing a lot of work with the Heritage Craft Association as well, so bringing that craft piece into our work. And then we're looking at global partners because, as with when I was a fashion stylist, I think it's a very competitive market, and you can't just focus on the UK. And so we're speaking to global partners about projects. And in terms of industry here, I admire anyone that's set up a business because I think it's an act of bravery. Definitely. You know, when I see another coffee shop open in Muswell Hill, which is up the road, my heart kind of sinks for them because I know what the rates are and the rent is. And I'm like, wow, you're selling a lot of coffee. And, you know, and I'm looking at the passing footfall thinking there's not enough footfall here. So it's an act of bravery. I think that, you know, we've got more stability in government. And I think that, you know, we could be doing public procurement made in the UK quite quickly. And they should be doing
It's actually also a really good story because, you know, if you want to like counteract reform, so I suppose there's a lot of the stuff that you're saying is also about bringing pride in our in culture, in manufacturing. And it doesn't need to be about, what's the word that I'm looking for? Othering people. It can actually just be about instilling pride in what we have, in the culture that we have, in the industries that we have. The
thing is that industry has always been an immigrant story.
Exactly.
You know, the Huguenots were the silk weavers in the East End, and manufacturing in Bradford and Leeds was an immigrant population as well. This is not new, right? But what I think about the reform is that their vision of this pastoral vision negates the reality of the immigrant populations that were here then as well. So, yeah, I think it's up for grabs. And I think there should be more pride in what immigrants have done for this country. Yeah, I mean, vibrancy. But I would argue this country's always had a vibe. And actually, when you look at the history of the fashion industry, you know, paisley came from India, cotton came from the Americas and the slave trade, and there are many stories about what immigration has done that are embedded in the culture. But I do think there has been a sense of, we want to talk about what a beautiful country is and how Kent's the Garden of England and, you know, the Northeast is God's own country, but we don't understand, therefore, that we have a power in that. And that, you know, that is something that we should be heroing, because this is a beautiful country. I mean, it is beautiful here. But by saying it, it doesn't mean that we're not powerful. Because France understands that it's powerful to talk about beauty. You know, Macron's wife's dripping in Dior and Yves Saint Laurent. Because she understands the power of the fashion industry. And of culture.
Cultural capital.
We have it here, and we need it, but it's almost like, it's like, oh no, let's not talk about it. Let's talk about aviation.
So you're saying that we can instill pride by celebrating our cultural capital, and that's our entire history.
But also by actually giving people skills. One thing the King said, I know that sounds really pretentious to say, one thing the King said to me, but one thing he said to me was, and he's a bit older than my mum, was that when they were at school, obviously they went to very different schools, is that they were taught hand skills. So my mother rebelled and said she wanted to do woodwork. And, you know, she's still using the magazine rack that she made. And if you don't instill hand skills, my son has not been taught how to sew a button on. What does that mean? That when he gets a hole in a shirt, he's going to throw it away? I
also think it's sort of counter to AI, that actually hand and all the stuff, you know, craft. I think it comes back to that actually hand skills, you can't replicate that.
Well, that's been my argument, is
repairing, whether it's repairing clothing or repairing buildings.
I mean, we haven't covered it, but the policy work around the creative industries and AI is very problematic that the government's rushing through. But the skills of the maker I would say, you know, if you've got a Windsor chair, which is a beautiful wooden chair, it's handmade, and it will last you maybe 3 generations. There's beauty and integrity in that, and a humanity in that you won't see in, you know, mass produced or AI design.
And also, and the fixing and repairing of that, it's very unlikely that you're going to get a robot to do that.
But that goes to the heart of the other thing that you were talking about earlier, is in a world where AI is coming, we are going to see mass unemployment, right? So unless we support the people who haven't got access to the jobs that will survive the AI revolution that everyone's running towards, like I would argue, like lambs to the slaughter, what do we then do with the demographics who haven't got the jobs that will be supported in that landscape? Because it will be those with those critical creative skills that will survive, or have got the financial security to pivot. And if you're not supporting people from lower income or lower educational opportunities, then we are throwing people on the scrap heap. And I think we've seen that with the miners in areas where we have mines, and we've seen 3 to 4 generations of poverty. But because we're so London focused, it's out of sight, out of mind.
So with that aside, are you optimistic?
I'm always a bit of an optimistic pessimist, or a pessimistic optimist. I think I'm always quite kind of like cautious, and I think, you know, I've done enough work on myself to know that comes from my background. And I think that I'm a realist, actually. I'm a realist about the fact that that the people that we have empowered don't always get it. And I'm open to being disappointed, but I do get a buzz out of proving people wrong.
But you are also doing a good job of trying to show people the bigger picture.
I can't tell you the amount of people that reach out going, I want to work in the fashion industry. And it's often their kids. It's often these policymakers' kids that want to work in the fashion industry, which I find interesting. And so it's still got a potent place. I still think they might be buying into the champagne and catwalk shows part of it rather than the nuts and bolts bit. But I am optimistic that at least we've got a government that's listening, and we've got a government that's stable. I think they need to now put some investment in. I think that the third runway is a mistake myself. And I think they could be getting the money out of the tax-free shopping. And having been a few weeks ago at Heathrow on a Friday evening, it was so hard to get in and out that I really worry for the people of West London of what that would look like, that third runway. And I think we need more infrastructure build so that we don't just rely on aeroplanes. But I am grateful that I live in a liberal democracy.
Yeah.
I'm grateful that if I have a voice of dissent, I don't end up in jail.
Yeah.
And although other countries might have more lucrative tax incentives for me to be in them, I'm able to, as a woman, have agency and voice here. And I'm frustrated that Labour hasn't had a female leader. I think that Yvette Cooper was the leader, the great leader we didn't
Yes,
have.
indeed.
But I feel that, and I think that sometimes they're in hock with unions that are also very white male, and aren't speaking for all of us. And they don't necessarily understand the world of freelancing or the world of creative. But for the next generation to come, I think we have to not be complacent.
Yeah.
Because AI is coming for a lot of these jobs, right? And I don't know that those in charge understand that the training that they're giving kids by focusing on STEM, I would argue, is the wrong education agenda for an AI revolution, because those jobs are the ones that are white.
You need the jobs that not the jobs that are the same as what the robots are doing, the jobs that are alternative to what the robots are doing. We need creativity to compete with the robots.
Yeah.